Hello, listeners. We are live coming to you from Arizona, from Spain, from everywhere. And we are going to be introducing our eighth episode of the Non-Existent story. I know that you've all been waiting breathlessly. So for today's episode, Casey, it's her turn. She's got some awesome stories for you. Yes, very awesome, I'm sure. And I will let her take it away.
Okay. Well, before I begin, so I have no excuse technically for not writing a story last week. But I wrote another story, but I wrote it in Spanish, and it's not suitable for English or my family to listen to. So I was productive. But and this week, I had an interview last night in 1:30 p.m. Chicago time, which is 8:30 p.m. Madrid time. And so it was only today that I started this and also finished it. But I wanted to tell people about Spain because sometimes people think that everything in Spain is great. And I want to show them that that's not true. Yeah. It's important that you understand this. So this is beer. It is called Mahou or Mahou. I'm not really sure. Mahou. It's the only kind of beer that you can get. It looks kind of like a Heineken-ish, but I mean, I kind of like it tastes like a Miller Lite or something like that. But it tastes so wrong, but it feels so right. Like it really, that should be like there's
hot where you are, I'm sure. Anywhere else.
Yeah, basically. Well, because it's been over 100, like all the time. Like, so it actually refreshes. So there's that. And then, so sangria is not as frequent of a thing as I would think. What you do have is something that's called tinto de verano, which is like red wine of summer. And you can buy it pre-mixed in a bottle that looks like this. I have not opened this yet. This is tinto de verano de Don Simon with lemon. But basically it's like Sprite with some wine thrown in. But again, it feels so right, the right time. And then Cody brought me a tiny bottle of homemade gazpacho, which is homemade in the sense that it was made at this place and it's home. But he thought it was a sauce, so he put it on his sandwiches, and then I opened the bottle and drank it, and he was horrified. But it's really good. So this is actually the best of all these things. So off to explain. All right, so the genre for today, and there's no music because I haven't gotten that far, is the Spiritist story. Spiritist? Spiritist. Okay. Not spirit, not spiritual. Definitely not spiritual. Spiritist. Okay, and so I begin. Summary 1. A party of friends meets in the Café del Siglo in the center of Madrid. Now it is an office building, but at this time, and for many years before and after, the Café del Siglo occupied 2 floors and half the block and was furnished with velvet divans and gaming tables where men in fine suits wagered their escudos and later their pesetas beneath imported crystal chandeliers. One of the group, an engineer and an atheist, recounts how that very same afternoon a young colleague of his told him that he was on his way to Rome because a spirit had instructed him to pay penance for his sins there. The engineer was flabbergasted. He knows the boy is no fool, and yet he would not stop talking about communications with spirits. Perhaps he is mad or possessed, thinks the engineer. Dr. Aguilar responds that according to Allan Kardec, this sort of subjugation by a spirit can only happen when the person participates, either out of weakness or out of desire. There is no such thing as total possession by a spirit. That is a vulgar concept. The engineer laughs and refuses to believe that a sensible man like Aguilar could ever put stock in Kardec's nonsense. Then Brigadier Montero, normally a man of few words, interjects. He is most distressed to see an intelligent man like the engineer so quick to dismiss something that he knows nothing at all about. With our eyes, says the brigadier, we see 6,000 stars in the sky, but with a telescope, one can behold 40 million, and even then countless more escape the view. You cannot see them, but still they are there. So too are the spirits. Amalia, as always, the only woman of the group, agrees. By way of example, she tells them about a couple she met earlier that summer at the sea baths of Deva. They were always together, talking and laughing. She had never before seen such happy people. The woman was 45 years old, while the man could not have been more than 25. One day, Happening to have an opportunity to speak with the woman in private, Amalia asked how she had met her husband and how it was that they were so happy. The woman, whose name was Anna, smiled and said that their marital bliss could only be explained by Spiritism, that is, the philosophical school which explains how it is that souls of the departed return to earth. And now I read the excerpt, which is the story that Anna told Amalia to explain her marital bliss. In first person. My father administered the magnificent estate of a wealthy banker. One summer, the banker's wife arrived with her son Rafael, who was about 12 years old and an invalid. His mother asked my father if I might stay with him in order to entertain Rafael and distract him from his illness. From the very beginning, I spent the whole day with Rafael, and his mother was most delighted with me upon seeing how her son's health improved. The next summer, however, the poor little boy suffered a relapse and could not leave his bed. His parents and I never left his side. He was a very formal child, and we talked like two little grown-ups. One afternoon, shortly before he died, Raphael told his mother that, if he were to have lived, he would have married me, and then, looking at me, said, "And you, wait for me, I will come back for you." For the next 10 days, which were the last days of his life, he would keep repeating, "Don't ever get married, wait for me, I will come for you, promise me you will never marry." And I promised him. When I was 15, I began to have suitors. Raphael's mother, Doña Magdalena, encouraged me to wed, but still I dreamt from time to time of Raphael and of him telling me to wait for him. "And what if Raphael comes back?" I asked Doña Magdalena, whereupon she would tell me not to be silly and that she loved me like a daughter, and the only thing she wanted for me was that I marry a good man and be happy. Then, one day, a few years later, Doña Magdalena's brother came to visit us from Cuba, together with his wife, who shortly after died giving birth to a son. Doña Magdalena wept and cried, "Ah, how that child reminds me of my son Rafael." "We will raise him," I said, "and we will give this baby the same name." His very first word was my name. The years passed, and we grew ever so fond of one another. I had many opportunities to marry, and well, but all my love was for little Rafael. The day he turned 20, he asked for my hand in marriage. I pointed out our difference in age, for I was 18 years his senior, but in vain. We married 6 years ago, and we have lived every one of them ever since as if it were paradise. "And so you believe your husband is the spirit of Raphael come back to earth?" Amalia asked. "I will tell you," said Anita. "As a child, my husband was a sleepwalker, and he used to get up in the middle of the night, walk to my bedroom and cry, 'Anita, Anita, I'm here.' Then for a long time he stopped. But one night, shortly after we were married, I felt him touch my shoulder. I saw that he was still sleeping, but he began to speak. He said, 'Anita, I've come back for you. I have loved you for centuries, and you waited for me.'" End of story 1. Summary of story 2. Are you ready?
Almost. 1 moment.
I hope you're taking notes.
Yes, not copious, but hopefully they will assist me soon. Now I am ready.
Summary 2. The Catalan spiritualist Jotim had still been hiding from the church's spies when he arranged to meet the American Dr. Wallace in, of all places, the Café del Príncipe, right across from the convent in the middle of Madrid. The Café del Príncipe was a small, shabby locale with pine wood tables and wicker chairs. But in the winter they served punch, barley water, and sarsaparilla. In the summer their famous sorbets, and all year long one could gaze out their windows in hopes of catching sight of one of the Sisters of Contemplation, entering or leaving the convent of the Order of the Barefoot Carmelites. Not many people know that the Café del Príncipe, precisely because it was so small, was the first café in Madrid to follow the Parisian fashion of lining the interior walls with mirrors. These mirrors lent the café an illusory infinity, while also permitting its male clientele to gaze not only at their beautiful companions, but also, and perhaps especially, at themselves sitting next to beautiful companions. But though these mirrors enhanced the light, exposing everyone to everyone, they also drew the patron's gaze away from the northwest corner of the bar. Curiously, ever since the mirrors had been installed, no one in the cafe had ever once thought to glance over at the table in the corner. It was the corner table of absolute liberty. Over the years, it had come to be one of the preferred meeting points for the myriad subspecies of dissidents and radicals that populated the fringes of the capital of the Spanish Empire. Napoleonistas, imperialistas, pragmatistas, absolutistas, monarquistas, carlistas, and progresistas had all in turn partaken of sarsaparillas and barley waters on the corner table. On this particular night, however, the barley waters were imbibed by two men who considered themselves mere free thinkers and men of reason, but who belonged to that great international community known and reviled as espiritualistas, or in English, spiritualists. Hidden by the mirrors and the smoke of cigars, tonight Wallace and Jotim will communicate with the spirits. Jotim lives here. Wallace brings with him news from their brethren in Boston, and, more to Jotim's surprise than his displeasure, his 14-year-old daughter, a delicate girl with golden hair and marble skin and bright blue eyes, though tonight rather reddened by smoke and lights. In preparation for the session, the two men become caught up in an impassioned discussion of the nature of the soul and how best to speak with it. Wallace's daughter eventually falls asleep on the table, knocking the tripod onto the floor. Jotim, infuriated and alarmed, rebukes Wallace for bringing her to their serious philosophical gathering, and Wallace turns to chastise her when suddenly she sits up, stiff as a telegraph pole. Her eyes turn back black as coals, and a strange glow like dappled moonlight appears on her arm and neck. And there falls from her mouth a great quantity of white foam that future generations will know to call ectoplasm, but which her father, now quite alarmed, believes to be the symptom of a poison, and decries this base and malicious Catholic treachery. Jotim leans over to clasp the girl to his breast so that she might die in his arms, when she begins to rap. With irregular pauses, long and short, her fist upon the table, steadily, never once looking down. Wallace records her taps and begins to translate them into words. Quote, the Catalan spiritualist Jotim had still been in hiding from the Catholic spies when he arranged to meet the American Dr. Wallace in the Café del Príncipe. The Café del Príncipe was a small shabby locale with pinewood tables and wicker chairs. ... And now the excerpt. And this excerpt occurs in a moment when Jotim and Wallace are discussing how exactly to use and interpret the communicative device that they will use to communicate with the spirits. They order their sorbets. Jotim asks Wallace why he has brought this lovely and delicate child. Surely she ought to be at home reading fairy tales. The girl responds that she does not like fairy tales. She prefers the kinds of stories her father tells her, because they are terrible, she says, and because they are true. With what innocent purity and simplicity speaks the girl child, exclaims Jotim, and her face is as beautiful as her spirit is pure. The body is only the leaf of the tree of life, observes Wallace rather curtly. Moreover, Mercedes is present because you specified that the magnetic activation of the communicative device requires 3 people, at least one of whom is an innocent, and I see you have brought no one. Trustworthy innocents are increasingly difficult to find here in Madrid, sighs Jotim. Mercedes is as quiet as the grave, assures Wallace. She will not betray us to the Catholics, and her innocence may even protect us should we be accosted by impure spirits. Jotim shows Wallace the brass tripod they will use to communicate with the spirits. Placing a hand on the top, like so, he says, one evokes a spirit, and when one of the tripod legs lifts up, any one of the 3 may ask the spirits any questions they please. Jotim and Wallace then fall to discussing this tripod's particular history, its magnetic properties, and the best way to position it, and whether any ritual need be performed in doing so, and what signs were received, what system to use to interpret them. In order to understand the spirit's replies, affirms Jotim, each leg must be given a number between 1 and 3, each number corresponding to 9 letters of the alphabet, which are also given numbers, the spirit thereby revealing which letters it wishes to name in order to form the words. But if we are magnetizing the spirit tripod, why not communicate via the electrical telegraphic code of Mr. Morse? Asks Wallace. Surely it would be faster and more accurate. Jotim is scandalized. The eternal spirits would hardly communicate with us like common American train operators. Only the basest of materialists would propose such a system. Ah, so you're familiar then with Mr. Morse's wonderful system, asked Wallace, delighted, for he is something of an enthusiast of long-distance communication. More or less, remarks Jotim dismissively, which they both know means no, not at all. Wallace sighs. I am most distressed to see an intelligent man like yourself so quick to dismiss something that he knows nothing at all about. We might at least conduct an experiment, evoking their names with the code and seeing if the spirits respond. But neither Jotim nor Wallace is certain if spirits have names, if they are earthly names or spirit names, if it is blasphemous to evoke them, or if their names change, or for that matter, if after bodily death the opinions and ideas of the spirit change once they return to a state of spirithood. And then they fall to discussing whether or not animals have spirits, why spirits must act secretly, why some children can communicate directly with spirits, why do babies cry when they are born, is rebellion part of the natural law, and finally, if any man can detain the march of human progress. And here they desist, for both of them agree that the march of human progress is impossible to detain. The end of that excerpt.
Okay. Well, I approve of both stories, and I
do a little like a sticker stamp.
Stamp of Hannah approval, official on both. So,
which in the case of ghost stories is particularly valuable.
Especially
19th century conversational ghost stories.
Okay. So I would like to discuss both, of course. I don't know that I have questions necessarily, but I have observations that I would be interested in getting your further input or thought on, certainly. So the two stories you've presented, and it helps me when I kind of summarize both questions a little bit, as what they have in common. The Spiritist story. So they both take place in Madrid, Spain, although the time periods don't necessarily have any play in the story. Although with the second one, just because it has a sort of seance-y feel to it, it makes me think more of like, I don't know, 19th century. But it could really happen, I imagine, at any time. So they both take place in Madrid in cafes, and the ambiance of the cafe is also very important in different ways in both stories. So in the first one, it's sort of snazzy, filled with candelabra and chandeliers and kind of expensively dressed men, 2-floor cafe. And it's a group of friends, and they are having a conversation about a person who is not there in his spiritual journey to Rome. And in the second one,
they begin that
way. That is how they begin.
Yes.
And then in the second one, it's a shabbier cafe, but there's an interesting dynamic with the mirrors in the cafe and how they're utilized both as... I like the mirrors because they seem to be a device that both exposed and camouflaged cafe. I thought that was kind of cool. So the men use the mirrors to sit next to beautiful women and see themselves sitting next to beautiful women, and everything is illuminated. But the mirrors also distract from a secretive corner where many dictators and used a long list of men that have...
Yeah, they're all kind of they're different groups or subgroups that at one time or another were kind of personas non grata, and kind of seen as dangerous to the state in Spain, or so infer. And the cafe settings, I mean, the cafe gives a little bit of information, because if you well, in the story that is real, if you look up the name of the cafe that is named, it tells you about it and when it stopped, when it was torn down and replaced by like a New Balance store or a government office or whatever. So they kind of both locate, both of the cafes were cafes that did exist in Madrid in the 19th century. Yes. And they kind of, I think they kind of serve to give a sense of a little bit of like the cultural life of, or at least what I would imagine the cultural life to be of the city at this time.
Yes. The structure of the two stories, though, was it was quite a bit different. So in the first one, it really becomes a sort of story within a story, with side stories interplaying, because you have these five, I believe it was five friends, and one makes this observation about someone not there that he thinks is ludicrous, that he's going on this pilgrimage to Rome because a spirit told him to, or
yes,
to make amends. And this person is an atheist. But then he worries that the person is making this journey because he is possessed, and he's an atheist, which I thought was kind of interesting, a bit strange.
He mentions the word possessed. I don't know if it's clear if he uses it interchangeably with insane, but it certainly, that is the word that he uses in the original text of whoever wrote it. Mm-hmm. So that does suggest that he you just have to remain Spain's super Catholic. Like, I don't think there's anything where even like the most skeptical person would be hard pressed to escape from some sort of, the discourse of Catholicism.
Okay.
Yes, but the Rome thing is just it's just kind of a throwaway anecdote. That it's kind of just the opening, so you kind of see where people stand on the particular topic.
Okay, interesting. And then there are several other characters who have comments about this atheist engineer's observation about this man. And then the woman tells her story, which is her insight into spiritualism and
Spiritism.
And I think that her conclusion about whether it exists or doesn't exist is a little unclear, or maybe she was more on the side that it does exist. I can't recall. I recall more about the story itself that she told and her experience with Spiritism. I
think, well, in the original, let's say, in the original, she is a fervent believer, but the story takes place before she had become a believer. So it was one of her first exposures to this philosophy that she will later ascribe to quite enthusiastically.
Okay.
But perhaps, yes, that wasn't clear in the excerpt.
I wasn't quite, and I mean, perhaps it would be easier if I could reference back. I have only my notes now to look back on for a lot of the different finer points of the story. But I was very I don't know if intrigued is the word, by this woman's story, because I found it super creepy. Not because that there was a ghost necessarily, but because I thought that the woman in question, Anna, was kind of frightening, in that she sort of had whatever maybe maternal connection with this little dying boy, who has certainly a non-maternal connection with her, and then he dies, and then she waits until some other dude a child, she knows this newborn is a child, and then he is named after this other dead child, and then they're raised very close with each other, and then they marry, and it's all because of this connection that she had with this other little dead boy. It was very creepy in that way. I don't know if you had any observations about that.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought as much about the maternal part, but it is true, like I mean, in a certain way you could consider it a ghost story, but it's not a ghost story in the sense that it wants to be frightening in any way. It's basically, this woman is incredibly happy, and yet when she tells why and how it is that she's so blissfully married to someone who's 20 years younger at a time, moreover, when that would be extremely unusual. When she tells you it sounds totally perverse, because she's replaced. I mean, the individual subjectivity is lost. Like, one person is another person, like, becomes that. So, I mean, imagine if you were raised by this woman who had promised to wait for a dead 12-year-old to come look for her, and then she gave you that name and she treated you as if you were him. But his perspective is totally absent. He seems to have just been, like, tickled pink with the entire situation. And then at the end, he gets to marry this 45-year-old woman.
Yeah, so you can only speculate the kind of influences that Anna has had on this second child, grown to man over the years, that he's now sleepwalks and speaks to her as if he was a dead 12-year-old, and with the narrator, you don't know, perhaps he is, perhaps he isn't, but it does lend itself to a very, yes, I think, perverse sort of psychological view of Anna.
It's a very complicated family dynamic, and then there are things that I've cut out that, well, I think it's important to know though that and I ended up, it was getting long, so I ended up not including this part, but she comes to live with this family and entertain the original Raphael, the invalid original Raphael, because her mother has died. The mother's always dead. They're always orphans, and then she's been mistreated in kind of Cinderella fashion. So there's this kind of subtext or background of, like, abuse and neglect, and then there's this impossible love that is legitimate from the story's perspective. Everyone's happy. She was faithful. But again, like, the contrast of, like, the abuse is not there, so it seems even more perverse than it did even when the contrast of the abuse was there, which was still quite perverse.
It lends itself to an interesting psychological study or case, I think, which is why I enjoyed it, and at the same time just was disturbed by it. So indeed. I like that a great deal. And then there's that parallel with the female figure, the child, the 15-year-old girl Mercedes, which I always thought of as a stripper name, although she's an innocent in this story, in the second story.
Or is she?
She was a very dramatic child, quiet as the grave, as described by her father, in this cafe, in this shabby cafe of mirrors, which both camouflaged and exposed. So the dynamic between the two men, although I think that the 15-year-old Mercedes is the innocent, as a parallel between the two stories is very interesting. And I could go on about that, but the relationship between the two men, or at least their discourse, to the second story, I think, more. And another recurring theme that came out in their discussion between the two stories is the justification for spiritists or spiritualism being, you shouldn't dismiss something that you don't know anything about. And that is the argument made in both at different points, is that, well, you shouldn't be so dismissive of spiritualism because you don't know anything about it. That's not, I don't know. I find a lot of fault within that argument, but it was interesting that it was a reoccurring one. I don't know if you had any observations about that.
It is a reoccurring one, and I admit it's taken. In one of them, it's an original statement, and in the other one, I duplicated it because it seemed to synthesize. I guess to give a little bit of background, I said they're both Spiritist stories, and that's true and not true. So there's a movement called Spiritism, and basically what happened, and this is enormously internationally influential, and very smart, important people have ascribed to it. Most famously, Conan Doyle, who was a huge proponent for 30 years. Yes. So the master of reason and deduction was an avid, obsessed spiritualist, especially after half of his family died in World War I. So the death is one of the great, death and a form of communication with departed loved ones is one of the great emotional motors. But the I would say epistemological, like the ideological or like ways of thinking or scientific motors are in the 1840s, in a house in New England, two sisters named Hannah and Casey. Where are we? Two sisters who did not, to my knowledge, share our names, but they could have. We could be their reincarnation. Heard a lot of tapping and rapping in their house, and it was observed and no one could like really understand it. And then there was this whole epidemic of what became known as the dancing tables, which sounds like a Sherlock Holmes story, but basically tables would move and no one knew why. And so these phenomena were observed scientifically with observation, and I'm imagining giant, magnifying glasses or something. And they're like, well, we need something to explain this observable fact. And the system of beliefs that arises is an incredibly complex system of beliefs, which I have a copy here because I've been investigating this since I got to Spain, which is why this topic is this is in Spanish, but the Book of Spirits, which is written by Allan Kardec in 1857. And it's basically the Spiritist Bible. And it presents itself as the soul lives on after someone dies. It's an individual and it persists. And in each subsequent reincarnation, it becomes closer and closer to perfection. So just as the world and science and knowledge are progressing and evolving towards social perfection and technological perfection, so too is this parallel spirit world progressing and progressing and progressing. And certain people who have the gift or who can be taught can communicate with these spirits, and you can talk to someone who has died that you love, which is the other big thing that people like about it. And it becomes enormously influential in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Conan Doyle was obsessed and gave demonstrations and went to Australia, and there are photographs and there's all these proofs, and then there's these hoaxes, and it's this gigantic thing that you can escape from once you start getting involved in it. But that's Spiritism. So that's this particular philosophical school, it calls itself, or religion, although it was very open to other religions, a very synthetic kind of creed. But then spiritualism was kind of what existed before he wrote this book. So in the 1840s, you have these weird little phenomenon that people think are ghosts. And spiritualists are people who try to figure out and communicate early on what's happening. So in a very subtle way, the second story is spiritualist because it doesn't really ascribe to Kardec per se, whereas in the first one is much more doctrinaire and is spiritist. I hope that made sense, at least a little bit.
I think so. And it makes me think of some horror films that I've seen that try to give themselves
but they're never scary.
About this historical placement. So there is a little background with the trying to approach it scientifically. I think more so than you see now with guys that just run around in the woods with cameras trying to document like ghosts or Bigfoot or something. So perhaps.
Well, yeah, but those kinds of products and shows, like if you go to a bookstore, there's an entire, like I went to like a Spiritist alternative philosophy bookstore, and it has like Gurdjieff and Theosophy and alchemy and astrology and Buddhism and yoga and Tai Chi and eat vegetables and all kinds of things, some of which make sense and some which don't. But this guy has his own shelf. So it's a big thing. Supposedly 3% of Brazil is Spiritist.
Well, yeah. It just sounds like something that Catholicism would lend itself to very naturally.
Yeah,
based on what little I do know about.
For a while, they were not all about it.
Yeah, but I mean, they're very. It's got. So I was recently in El Paso, looking into Mexico on this mountain with some friends, and one of them. There's this big. It looks like an insane asylum to me, in the oldest and creepiest sense of the word. And apparently, it's El Paso's oldest high school, and it's still in operation. And
oh my god, that sounds incredible.
The guy, I believe he went there because he's lived in El Paso for like 16 years.
Wait, who went?
And some friends in El Paso, and one of them had lived in El Paso for some time, and the other one is in the army, so it's a temporary thing. But he lived in El Paso for some time, and he, I think, had attended that high school. And I wish I could remember the name, but it's very well known, at least if you're in El Paso. And it has tons of ghost stories associated with it. And most of the population is, of course, Hispanic. And I would infer, or at least parts of their family are very Catholic. And I guess there's underground tunnels, supposedly, that go from the high school into Mexico, which is less than like a couple miles away. You can see the high school and then the Mexican border and the big X and everything. Like, it's all right there.
Oh, wow.
And there's many, many ghost stories associated with that school, which just looking at it, you would imagine that there had to be. So I guess in my mind, for better or for worse, the two, Catholicism and ghost stories and fear of the supernatural, are all very closely linked. So
yeah, I mean, it was hugely influential in Mexico, and Mexico has an enormous tradition which integrates this particular vein, but then has, I think, other veins. So yeah, and again, like Catholicism just kind of lent itself, I think, or it was originally a French movement actually, but France was kind of the intellectual capital, and so it was kind of embraced by Spain. And yes, there are tendencies in certain cultures to be more open to parallel realms and thinking that there are things beyond the limits of rational, quote unquote, scientific observable phenomenon. So, but I think that the interest, like why I wouldn't call them ghost stories in this case, I guess, is just like, again, it's more about, for me, what I find interesting from like a research point of view is that it has to do with apparitions and communication. So it's like kind of a language problem. Like, how do you communicate? How do you interpret these communications? Like, they're the same kind of issues that you would have with any text that you approach, right? How to decipher, how to communicate, how much authority, because some spirits are super pure and advanced in their progress towards God, and they speak in really high elevated language. And then there are like low impure spirits, much like there are low impure people, because it is, again, the 19th century. And they might speak in a more frivolous way, and lots of people kind of, screwed around with this, and they became like a pretext for all kinds of other stuff. And then there's this whole undercurrent of like sexuality, and a lot of them, as you notice, particularly, or at least in the first one, it's much more prominent. And the second one, it's more subtle. But in this whole collection of Spiritist stories, which I will tell you about when you guess, the figure of the 14-year-old innocent girl is kind of the child bride thing is kind of thematized and eroticized or what have you. But yeah, the communication things, and then the miscommunication potential and how to decipher in different ways and different tactics that they use, I find to be like pretty interesting. I'm mostly looking for photographs, actually, because those are pretty cool.
Those are very cool for that time. That I would think of as one of the first well-known instances of the phenomena of Photoshop.
Yes, unless you're not a believer.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Did you? That's the point. It was
the topic interesting. I'm certainly happy to learn more about it. But as a case study, or as many case studies of what is interesting but bizarre about human behavior as opposed to spiritual behavior, I think would be why I would be drawn to it.
Yes, I think it is ultimately about the human for me as well, particularly in the ways in which people will project other kinds of logics, like, I don't know, turning one person into another person because that's your fantasy, into this kind of psychological or this spiritual dimension. So, because there are many things at play.
Yeah, and you don't even need to look into spiritualism to see when people do this. I mean, people project in millions of different ways, but there was a really kind of gruesome article that I had read perhaps a year ago, not even a year ago, about this woman who it's a kind of communication that a school of thought espouses to when you're working with certain people with mental and physical disabilities. That almost uses them like a Ouija board, where they'll hold the person's hand and then the person will move their hand from letter to letter in order to communicate just what they themselves want to say. However, sometimes whoever's holding their hand, even as a trained professional, will kind of project what it is that they want that person to say. And then that was linked with an affair that, in turn, a psychologist and behaviorist had with one of their patients, because the patient wanted to, as they communicated to the psychologist. And it became, I don't know. I don't know if I would recommend you read the article or not. I mean, it is very well written and fascinating, but still very disturbing.
It's just, I think it's still like interesting in terms of, again, like what people desire and what they're afraid of in themselves. And I think, I mean, like what you just described is basically if you just put that same people together but at a table, and then the person whose hand's moving is like been instructed or been told or been conditioned to think that, or would like to think, because if you don't really have access to education, or if you don't have, is in a very hierarchical society, if you have a gift, then you become special, and then you move your hand. In many cases, there's enormous amounts of records of people just writing messages and things like that. So this kind of like you suspend volition and you have something act through you, but it's obviously there's still some volition at play.
Yes,
or so I would think. But yes, in that particular exploitative case, and it can become quite disturbing. And there's a lot with Spiritism and some darker sides. There's this one case of a woman in France who would have like, there's this whole ectoplasm thing. So it's like this white stuff that would kind of shoot out of your orifices. And so she would like run around in like this stage, and like men would come to like the mediumistic spiritual session, and she'd like have these like white things streaming down and like an apparition of a woman, and then she'd like just flash everyone everything. And then it was like this kind of like weird erotic thing that I'm really glad that our parents will be listening to this episode. Now that I think about this. That's awesome. Yeah, but yes, so the Claire Eva Carriere is the case of Eva Carriere is quite that's the juicy Wikipedia page. You cannot.
Oh, I bet.
Scintillating Wikipedia at its finest.
Oh, so yes, in summary, excellent genre to investigate and focus on for this week's episode, I think.
Thank you. It could well be a book if I get hired and someone pays me to work on this stuff.
Yeah, definitely it could. It lends itself in many ways to very entertaining reading.
Well, this is I would actually have to like, I would be more scientific, and I'd have quotes and make an argument, things like that. This is the fun part.
Yeah, the easy stuff is fun too. So I will now, I believe, choose which of these stories that you wrote and which one is already published. And I'm going to wait until I see if I guessed correctly before I say anything else about the why, because I don't want to embarrass myself if I choose them. If I explain my reasoning.
I think this one's pretty easy, actually. I think you'll get this one.
So I think because of how the two men spoke with each other in the second story, the tone and the subject of their dialogue, the way they communicated with each other, and also for some reason because sarsaparilla was mentioned, I think that you wrote the second story.
Yes, I did.
I think. Okay.
Sarsaparilla was hell.
You paused, the pregnant pause there. I was like, oh shit.
No, dude. Well, I'm glad that you think that I didn't come up with the first one, because that would be like a major psychological revelation that I probably wouldn't want to make.
No. I would just trust that your vast array of reading knowledge and exposure. I try not to make insights into somebody's perverse thoughts on relationships, at least until they've written maybe more than 3 or 4 about the same topic, and then I'm like, okay, I'm really seeing a problem here, maybe.
Really?
1 or 2, though. It's totally cool.
Yeah, no. Yes, so I definitely, I did write the first one, or I did write the second one. I think the tone was slightly more playful, so that probably gave it away. So there's only so much seriousness with which you can take it. Yes, I never really slip into satire. As do you, actually. We tend that way. The world is so amusing. But yeah, I'll tell you more about the first one after you tell me. Oh, you tell me why. because of sarsaparilla and the tone of the
Well, a little
excerpt?
bit because of sarsaparilla, but mostly because of not even necessarily the tone, but the conversation between the two men. So I'm getting the ether. No, I'm not.
Wait, I see a hand on your shoulder.
So I'm starting to pick up, I think, a recurring, I don't know if theme is the right word, pieces that you write. Maybe device would be better. So particularly, and this is going to screw me in the future because you're going to stop doing it and I'm going to have no clues and guessing which one you wrote and which one you didn't.
No, that'll make it more interesting.
Maybe. When you have characters interacting with each other, often there's kind of vein. So they're always they're either learning something from each other or they're teaching something to each other or they're exploring an avenue of thought. So it's always that tends to be how they communicate with each other. It's either teacher and student or it's the one person who's communicating to his audience something educational they're trying to teach. I've seen that, I think, in several of your stories. And so because that
really
was more
interesting.
prevalent,
I did not think you were going to do that.
Yeah, between the two men speaking with each other when they were talking about the tripod, explaining courses, well, this is how this could work and this is why. And I disdain that and it is very silly because of this reason. And well, blah, blah, blah. There was a very instructive tone, or more instructive tone, I think, which was less prevalent in the first one, even though it's a discussion, it's a discourse about trying to establish in the first story whether or not, I suppose, this man going to Rome is ridiculous. But the five characters, they give stories that are to the subject, but it's a little bit more open. Whereas with the men in the second two, it was more
combative?
Purely instructive. No, not combative. I think more purely instructive, as opposed to maybe using. I don't know. It's difficult for me to explain, but I recognize it when I hear it. I'm starting to recognize it.
That's interesting. I mean, in the context of this particular story, because it's about the confluence of, and I find this topic very fascinating always, the limits of rational thought, and when you start to verge into and this is Sherlock Holmes is a great example. I think that there's a limit that you reach with hyper rationality where it starts to become fantastical. Like the two extremes meet or something like that. And I love that theme, and it's in all of my favorite writers. And then I might just be a pedantic human being too. And my relationships with human beings are usually around teaching or explaining or being taught or explained. The student-teacher thing is a big thing, I think, with all my personal relationships probably too, which I think is good. I like that. But that's interesting. Yeah, whereas the first one, I mean, so to give you some context about the first one, it's actually, and I cheated a bit because I wanted to give enough background information without saying all about the author. But it's actually a woman. Her name is Amalia Domingo Soler, and she's from Spain. She's born in like the early 19th century, like 1835, I think. And then she was always sickly. She was mostly blind. And then her mother died when she was relatively young. And then she worked as like a seamstress, but that wasn't working very well with the vision. And she was really struggling. And so she's like this like solitary blind woman in Spain in the 19th century, which is not an enviable position. And then she discovers these teachings of that book that I showed you, Allan Kardec, and she gets totally into it, and she becomes obsessed, and she wrote like 2,000 stories or something like that, or 2,000 texts, and she starts running journals, and she makes all these friends, and she has this whole big network. So it was like for her actual material existence, it was hugely important. And her stories are, I mean, they're kind of sentimental and, Victorian and I found this one to be like the least lachrymose. Some of them are just like absolutely impossible. But the title of this one is actually "Wait for Me!" exclamation point. So she's a lot of stories that are just like, you know, exclamation points in them. Wait for me! Don't give up! Tenderness! Exclamation point. Violets! Double exclamation point. Like there's
It's just not
like,
very Victorian.
they're unbearably sentimental, but she's beloved, and the spiritualists or the spiritists today still like really revere her, and like you can get all her stuff online super easy. That's where I found this. I mean, I translated that, but then the opening part I took from another story of hers in the same collection because I thought it kind of I liked the conversational dynamic, and that it gave it presented the debate. So that's one of the things. Either people are debating about whether or not spiritualism is right, and then they're inevitably proven wrong by someone's crazy story, and then they become propagandists and evangelize, or it's like something that happened one time when she was young. So I wanted to have both in one. So I think the one about the really creepy couple, which is like the core of the story, Rafael, the two Rafaels, is called "Wait for Me!" exclamation point, and then the previous one, which starts out with the cafe, is titled "Spiritism Must Be Studied," which indeed
must it though? Yes. No, I'm so glad that you did the two together. It really worked. I think that using the two really worked.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah. So. So she mentions the cafe in Madrid, and I like that because I've been wandering around Madrid, and I'm in Madrid. Like I liked the actual physical location, and then I looked up the name of the cafe. This is maybe the cheating part. I looked up the name, and then I found a description of that, and I translated that, and I included it, and I added a couple things because it's a summary. And so I gave extra. She doesn't pay any attention to the cafe, but I really liked that. For a reason that is not necessarily congruent with the rest of the stories, but I liked this public space thing, and then like this secret, dark, cavernous ghost encounter. And so I played it up a lot in the next one, which I found a different cafe, and then I made some stuff up. But I found also about that other cafe, which is earlier, the Principe one. That was it. The Wikipedia page talked about the drinks that it served, and obviously sarsaparilla, which is spelled with Z's in Spanish, which I think is great. It makes it even more delicious sounding. Sarsaparilla.
Yes. Although it made me think a little bit too of the Green Mill, Chicago, because that's the only historically. Yeah, the only. I mean, it's not a cafe, but it's the only kind of place where beverages are served that I've ever been into that's got that kind of historical ambiance and character to it.
We'll go to Europe sometime. I'll take you to some places because I like them. But I started actually, and so like when I was thinking about this story this morning, because I'd read the other one earlier this week, and so I was like, I'll just go with that one, even though it's not like great literature, because nothing else was really working. And so then I was thinking about it, and so I was like, well, I should go to a cafe when I write this. I'm sure that would be stimulating. And so I found one eventually that actually had Wi-Fi, but then I couldn't connect. So I was like writing this like without any reference points, which you kind of needed, and it was like playing Rihanna the whole time. And like Pharrell.
Quite what I need to be listening to right now.
Right. If I played music for the background, it would have been Pharrell Happy. For both of them.
Just by Katy Perry, maybe. No, well, before this call, I was listening to. Daniel had never seen Pulp Fiction, so yesterday Daniel and I watched it together, and it reminded me of one of the reasons is his most excellent soundtracks. So I was listening to Reservoir Dogs soundtrack on YouTube right before the call. And I almost proposed that I just pick a random one and play it while you read, just to see what would happen.
Oh yeah, that would have been interesting. I mean, the Pulp Fiction soundtrack I had, that was like the third CD I ever owned.
Really?
So yeah, like even before I saw the movie, like I listened to it a lot because it's fun, and I still like that music to this day. So it was like super informative. But I could quote you like, "I love you, honey bunny," I love, and like how it starts off, which is kind of funny that you mentioned because it's like surfer music, and I'm taking ukulele lessons here, which is awesome, from this guy named Sergio Leon, who's like Argentine, but he's been here forever. But he likes the ukulele because he used to be in a Hawaiian rock band.
It's so cool.
It's like it's just total highlight.
Yeah, that is awesome. But we're detracting. So I keep forgetting whenever it's my turn to do analysis to ask you before I see it pop up on the website. Side note, listeners, visit our website at wordpress.com. We are the non-existent story. But I keep forgetting to ask you, what would you call your story? And I hope it has an exclamation point.
It needs to, actually, this is the one time you ask, and I haven't quite figured that out because I didn't necessarily, for reasons that you might imagine, want to duplicate the titles that Amalia uses.
Tenderness.
So right now I have the electro-spiritual telegraph girl.
It sounds like a superpower.
So I would have to, there's that, because again, like I can't do the moralizing thing, like it just doesn't, no me sale, like it just doesn't come out. But I should, yeah, maybe I should just do spiritualism must be studied, exclamation point. So I'm not sure, actually. But I'll follow your advice, as always, very sound, at least in literary matters, of including exclamation points in both. And something moralizing.
I can only hope. I'm sure whatever you come up with will be clever and poetic and deep. But I hope it also will include an exclamation point.
It makes it so much deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all right, so basically, we should talk about timing because I broke our run and took an extra week. So we can either start, as you suggested, moving to bi-weekly, or you can just have that card to play when you want.
I'll have to consider. Well, it might need to move to bi-weekly at least by August, because that's when I start my classes. Although, fortunately, it's only going to be two classes a week. But I do want to have a lot of study time dedicated to it, which I can because I am otherwise unengaged, as you know, in pretty much anything. So that should work out.
That's awesome. I am sure that.
I don't blame you at all for choosing or needing to skip a week, because you are in Spain, and I would probably, if I were in Spain, being like, I'm going to put this all on hold until I get back. So no issue there.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that I did not disappoint. Okay, well, maybe we'll see how this week goes for you, I guess, and if you feel inspired and you want to next week, and if not, then and if you don't feel inspired or you want more time, then we can switch to bi-weekly.
Yeah, I think I should be good by next Thursday or Friday. But I suggest that we switch to offline so that we can discuss a couple other things that have been going on, which should be interesting for you and maybe for the non-existent story. But I don't want to leave any spoilers. Okay.
Yeah, no, all right, let me detain this, and I'll cut this last part out anyway. But all right, detain.